I used to think that being the good daughter, the quiet one, the dependable one, would eventually mean something. But in our house, invisibility wasn't a punishment. It was my role. And I wore it like a second skin, because no one ever taught me I could refuse. My name is Olivia Taylor, and I am 31 years old. I work as a software project manager in Chicago, but my real job, my lifelong, unpaid, all-consuming job, was always being Jessica's sister. From the moment I could form coherent thoughts, Jessica had already been assigned the title of the beautiful one, the social butterfly, the natural performer. Meanwhile, I was described in family circles with words like smart, practical, or mature for her age, which in our home, were code for not much to look at, but at least she's useful. Jessica is 2 years younger than me, but somehow she always seemed to lead, even as a toddler. She walked into rooms like she owned them, had grown men wrapped around her tiny pink painted fingers before she could recite the alphabet, and knew the exact tilt of her head that made my mother sigh with adoration. I was the one who helped clean up the toys after her tantrums. I was the one who turned off the stove when Mom forgot about dinner because Jessica was singing show tunes in the living room. I was the one who had to remind everyone when the electric bill was due, even before I was old enough to drive. Our mother, Karen, was a former pageant queen who'd aged into a PTA president and suburban socialite. In her eyes, Jessica was her second chance at stardom. She'd dress her in glittery dresses for no reason at all, straighten her platinum curls before school just in case someone from the paper showed up, and beam with unfiltered pride when Jessica won even the smallest awards, like the time she got a sticker for Best Smile in kindergarten and Mom laminated it. Meanwhile, I brought home a science fair ribbon and was told, "Don't get cocky, Liv. Looks fade, but you've got your brain." That was how love was handed out in our house, loud and abundant for beauty, careful and conditional for everything else. From as early as I can remember, I was made to understand that Jessica's light didn't just shine, it eclipsed. And I was expected to orbit her, to reflect whatever warmth she had left over. I became her fixer, her cheerleader, her built-in audience. When she couldn't finish her math homework, I did it. When she failed to prepare for a debate in middle school, I whispered the cue cards to her through the bathroom door. And when she threw a screaming fit because her prom date bailed at the last minute, I called in a favor from a friend to step in. I wasn't just expected to help. I was expected to disappear while doing it. But I think the first time I realized I didn't really exist in my own right was in 8th grade. I had a crush on a boy named Ryan Morales. He was a year older, funny, kind, and he liked manga, which, to me, felt like fate. I had just built up the courage to talk to him one afternoon at lunch when Jessica came strutting up behind me, flipped her hair, and asked me in front of him if I'd remembered to put on deodorant. The laughter that followed still haunts me, and I didn't speak to Ryan again. 3 weeks later, he was holding hands with Jessica at the Halloween dance. Jessica said it wasn't personal. "I didn't even know you liked him," she shrugged. But she knew. She always knew. By 15, I had developed a borderline phobic relationship with mirrors. I hated my nose, too wide, too sloped. My jaw, too square. My skin, too dull next to Jessica's glow. And the worst moment came the day a boy I liked made a joke about my profile, laughing that I looked like the before in a plastic surgery ad. I laughed too, pretending it didn't sting, pretending it was just another joke in a world where I was never the punchline's subject, just its setting. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I sat in the bathroom with the lights off, tracing the outline of my face in the mirror and wondering what it would feel like to be beautiful, even for a day. Not striking, not pretty enough to stop traffic, but just enough to be seen. Not enough to be Jessica. Just enough to be not invisible. My mother never asked what was wrong. She was too busy rehearsing Jessica's audition lines for the local youth theater. She made Olivia was born responsible jokes to her friends while pouring them boxed wine, always with the implication that my usefulness compensated for my lack of sparkle. "She's not like Jess," she'd say. "But she's the kind of girl who'll always have a job, you know? A job. A plan. A schedule." I became addicted to being reliable because it was the only thing I was ever praised for. If I couldn't be adored, I'd be indispensable. I helped plan Jessica's Sweet 16, coordinated her college visits, proofread her essays, and even worked extra shifts at my part-time job to help cover her books freshman year when our parents said money was tight. I got a simple thanks, live text in response. I told myself it was enough. But the truth? I was starving for acknowledgement, for some sign that someone saw me as more than Jessica's personal assistant with a family discount. When I graduated high school with honors and was offered a scholarship to Northwestern, my parents barely looked up from their dinner. "That's great, honey," my dad said without emotion, eyes still fixed on his plate. Meanwhile, Jessica had just started her sophomore year at Arizona State, and Mom couldn't stop gushing about how she was just so photogenic, even in candid shots. That week, she spent $200 on a care package to mail to her. I paid my own deposit for college with a check I had written from my savings account, money I had earned tutoring algebra and babysitting for the neighbor's demon child. I don't think it's dramatic to say that by the time I was 19, I had completely ceased to believe I mattered. I was a second draft, a placeholder, a plan B of a daughter. And while Jessica thrived on Instagram filters, birthday trips, and an endless supply of second chances, I disappeared into my classes, my books, my structured little life. I created color-coded calendars. I scheduled my existence like a spreadsheet. It was the only way to feel like I was real. Jessica dropped out of college junior year. She said the environment was too stifling, which I later learned was code for she didn't want to study. She came home with tears and excuses, and within weeks, she had a new internship at a boutique PR firm that one of Mom's friends owned. Everyone was so proud of her for pivoting gracefully. I started crying in my dorm room that night and didn't stop for hours. I should have seen it sooner. The emotional manipulation. The way she'd take up space and oxygen and somehow make it your fault when she left you gasping. But I didn't. Not yet. That awareness was still waiting for me, quietly sharpening its edge. And when the time came, it would slice through everything I believed about loyalty, love, and what it means to finally stand up for yourself. This was just the beginning. The night before my first surgery, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my tiny one-bedroom apartment just outside downtown Chicago, staring at my reflection like it was someone else's face I had stolen by accident. My jaw felt too strong, my nose too angular, too prominent, features I had memorized with the kind of bitter familiarity that turns into obsession. I knew every bump, every asymmetry, every line I had been told made me distinctive, which was the polite way people described a face they couldn't compliment. I was 26, and I had waited 10 years for this moment, 10 years of swallowing self-loathing in polite doses, like daily vitamins. 10 years of nodding along when people said, "It's what's on the inside that counts," while their eyes betrayed the truth they didn't dare speak aloud. It wasn't about becoming beautiful, not really. It was about no longer being immediately forgettable or visibly less than whenever I stood next to Jessica. The procedure wasn't drastic. I wasn't trying to reinvent myself or chase some celebrity blueprint. I wanted the nose I should have been born with, the one that didn't make people pause awkwardly mid-conversation when they tried to find something nice to say. I wanted my jawline to stop looking like it had been carved with a box cutter in bad lighting. I had consulted with 3 different surgeons, read every possible horror story, and saved for over 5 years. I had researched clinics like it was a second job and taken on freelance design work after hours just to afford it without touching my emergency savings. I told no one. Not my parents, who would have called it vain. Not Jessica, who would have found a way to make it about her. Not even my closest friend, Mallory, who had been the one soft spot in an otherwise utilitarian life. This was mine. This was the one thing I was doing purely for myself, without needing to justify, explain, or apologize for it. And when I woke up in the recovery room hours later, groggy and sore and bandaged like a science experiment, I felt something unfamiliar spreading in my chest, something that might have been pride, if not for the guilt that immediately followed. Because while I was secretly stitching together a better version of myself, Jessica was unraveling yet another opportunity my parents had bankrolled. After failing out of Arizona State and blaming toxic roommates, she had spent a year bouncing between unpaid internships and yoga teacher training before announcing she wanted to go back to school for social media marketing. My parents called me late one night, voices tired and rehearsed, as if they'd already decided the outcome before I picked up the phone. "Jess is serious this time," Mom said, her tone dipping into the hopeful desperation she reserved only for my sister. "She just needs a fresh start, Liv." I already knew where the conversation was headed. They couldn't afford to co-sign another student loan, and Jessica's credit was already shredded from a boutique clothing line she tried to launch the year prior. I was the obvious solution, as always. They didn't have to ask outright. The guilt was built into the pauses between words. So I said yes. I always did. I took on an extra consulting project, canceled the trip to Bali I had been planning for nearly 2 years, and wired the money directly to the school's bursar. I told myself I didn't need the beach, or the passport stamps, or the once-in-a-lifetime memories. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I told myself that family meant making sacrifices, even if no one ever noticed them. No one ever did. Instead, Jessica posted Instagram stories about her new college girl era, complete with pumpkin spice lattes and second-row seats at Coachella. She never mentioned who helped make that possible. My mother told me I was being negative when I brought it up gently one evening over dinner. "Jess just has a different way of appreciating things," she said, reaching for the wine glass I had just filled. That was always the problem. Jessica's gratitude was like a solar eclipse, brief, dramatic, and usually overshadowing everything else around it. Mine was a background fixture, expected like the sunrise. Meanwhile, I was learning how to dress my new face, not because it had changed everything, but because it had changed enough. Strangers no longer looked past me on trains or in crowded meetings. Baristas remembered my name without prompting. For the first time in my life, someone at work told me I had a very striking presence. It wasn't about validation, not entirely. It was about finally not being invisible in rooms where I had always blended into the walls. I started taking more pride in how I carried myself, not in a showy way, but in subtle shifts, the way I made eye contact during presentations, the confidence in my voice when I negotiated vendor contracts. I wasn't suddenly transformed into some goddess. I was still Olivia, quiet, dependable, slightly too intense about task management, but I was Olivia on her own terms. That confidence bled into my personal life too. I started reconnecting with people I'd distanced myself from during the chaos of Jessica's emergencies. Mallory and I began meeting weekly for yoga and brunch, and for the first time in years, I let myself talk, really talk, about what I wanted. A future beyond crisis management. A home that didn't feel like a bunker. A partner who saw me, not just someone to lean on until they felt strong enough to leave. I even dated someone for a while, a dentist named Evan, who was kind and patient and too perceptive for my comfort. He noticed things I hadn't wanted to share. The way I deflected compliments. How I always offered help but never accepted it. He once asked me why I always kept my phone on at dinner, even during our third date. "Because someone might need me," I said without thinking. The words sounded noble in my head but hollow out loud. "Would it be okay if someone needed you for once?" he asked gently. I didn't have an answer, and 3 weeks later, I let the relationship fade out under the excuse of timing. The truth was, I didn't know how to be cared for. It felt unfamiliar. Suspicious, even. Like an IOU I didn't remember signing. So I went back to work. I took on more clients. I became the person everyone depended on, at the office, in the family, in my friend group. I organized birthday dinners, paid vet bills when a friend was short, co-signed a lease for a cousin who barely remembered my birthday. I was everyone's emergency contact and no one's priority. My 20s passed like that, productive but laced with a quiet ache, like background music in a film no one remembers. I kept thinking the payoff would come, eventually. That someone would see what I was doing, would name the love I kept offering without condition. But the recognition never came, not even when I stood in the background of Jessica's graduation photos, the second try, the one I helped pay for, smiling while my parents held up signs that said, "Our star." They didn't ask if I wanted a photo. I took them. I remember coming home that night to my apartment, small but pristine, and staring at my reflection again. My face had healed years ago. The swelling was gone, the scars faded. I looked like myself. A better version. A stronger one. But something inside still hurt. Not because of the surgery. Not because of the sacrifices. But because I had rebuilt myself quietly, brick by brick, and I was still invisible to the people I most wanted to notice. I didn't regret the choices I made. I still don't. Every job I took, every vacation I canceled, every late-night call I answered without hesitation, they shaped me. They gave me discipline. They made me resilient. But they also taught me something else, that loyalty, when given without limits, becomes a leash. And I was finally starting to feel the choke. I should have known it was going to fall apart the moment Jessica asked me to be her maid of honor. The words came out of her mouth like a compliment, but I heard them for what they were, another obligation wrapped in faux sentiment, another line in the endless job description I never applied for but was born into. She called it a gesture of closeness. I recognized it as a final test, a last performance where I was meant to smile, serve, and fade out behind her veil. Still, I said yes. Of course I did. That's what I had always done, hadn't I? She was marrying a man named Colin, tall, handsome, with an expensive haircut and the hollow eyes of someone who loved being photographed more than he loved being known. He was everything my mother wanted for her daughter: pedigree, potential, and plenty of practiced charm. He worked in finance, threw around phrases like strategic synergy, and once told me during a family dinner that he'd never met a woman who enjoyed coding before. I had simply smiled, suppressing the urge to remind him that not every woman's ambition ended with a bridal registry. The months leading up to the wedding were a blur of spreadsheets, fittings, vendor negotiations, and Jessica's increasingly erratic texts, each one more frantic than the last. Can you double-check the florist? Do we need to rehearse the toast? OMG, did you confirm the DJ's dinner option? She never asked how I was doing. Not once. But she sent me 3 separate Pinterest boards and 2 FaceTime calls to make sure my maid of honor dress wouldn't clash with the overall aesthetic. She chose champagne silk for the bridesmaids, slippery, pale, cruel in daylight. It washed me out completely, but I said nothing. When she asked if I could cover the cost of the bridal suite for one extra night since she was a little over budget, I transferred the funds that afternoon without question. I didn't tell her it meant I would have to skip a work trip that could have landed me a promotion. I didn't tell anyone. That was the story of my life, making sacrifices so seamlessly they looked like choices. But the speech? The speech was mine. For once, I wanted to say something real. Not some recycled platitudes about love and laughter. Not a bullet-pointed list of Jessica's greatest hits. I wanted to speak the truth in a way that honored both of us, because despite everything, some part of me still believed in the idea of family, in redemption, in the kind of storytelling that doesn't hurt even when it bleeds. So I wrote it late at night in my apartment, the city lights blinking through the blinds, while a jazz playlist hummed low in the background. I started with a memory, me and Jessica in our shared bedroom, age 9 and 7, building a pillow fort during a thunderstorm. I described how she had insisted on being the queen of the castle while I quietly reinforced the base with hardcover books so it wouldn't collapse. I talked about growing up with a sister who lit up rooms while I memorized the power outlets in the dark corners. I talked about love that wasn't always easy but was always enduring. I told the truth. Carefully. Gently. I didn't name the pain directly, but I let it exist between the lines, like the echo of something broken that had finally been swept away. And near the end, I said something I had never said before, not even to myself. There was a time in my life when I felt invisible, when I thought love was something you had to earn by being useful. But Jessica, she taught me that love can also be loud and chaotic and incandescent. That it can change shape, soften, return. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't vindictive. It was honest. earnest, poetic, even. The wedding day arrived sweltering and glittering like a fever dream. The venue was absurd, an estate mansion north of Chicago with marble columns, peacocks in the garden, and an actual string quartet rehearsing Coldplay. Jessica was a vision in couture lace, her hair twisted into soft waves, her makeup flawless down to the freckle she insisted be enhanced for effect. She looked radiant, yes, but also tightly wound, like a porcelain doll perched too close to an edge. She flitted from room to room, checking everything twice, demanding corrections in her syrupy sweet voice that always ended with, no pressure, but. I held her bouquet while she adjusted her veil. I tracked down the missing groomsmen. I reapplied her lipstick with shaking hands when the makeup artist bailed. I was her anchor, her assistant, her calming presence. And then it was time. The ceremony passed in a haze of white roses, flash photography, and one too many, "Can you believe how lucky she is?" whispers from the crowd. During the recessional, Jessica looked over her shoulder and winked at me. I smiled back. But inside, something had begun to fray. At the reception, the champagne flowed like it was trying to drown us. Colin gave a toast about partnership and timeless love and something that vaguely referenced Jessica's TikTok followers. My father cried. My mother preened. Then they called my name. I walked to the microphone slowly, heart hammering, palms dry, face perfectly composed. The ballroom quieted. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me, some curious, some expectant, most assuming they'd hear a few jokes, a tear or two, and then more dancing. They didn't expect poetry. They didn't expect clarity. They didn't expect truth. I began. I want to tell you about my sister, not just the stunning bride you see today, but the girl who once taped glow-in-the-dark stars to our ceiling because I was afraid of the dark. I let the words bloom slowly, deliberately, like petals opening to air. I watched faces soften, saw heads nod. A few people dabbed at their eyes. Jessica smiled, small, tight, but not hostile. I moved into the next part, the part about my own shadow. There were years when I felt like I only existed in the spaces she left behind, when I thought my worth depended on staying quiet, staying small, being helpful. I heard a breath catch somewhere to my left. My mother stiffened. Jessica's eyes glittered. But over time, I continued, I learned that love isn't measured by how invisible you can become to make others comfortable. It's in the moments you choose to show up, fully, honestly, even if your voice shakes. There was silence. A good silence. The kind that hangs heavy because it matters. And then, from behind me, I heard the voice. Jessica. Oh my God, are we really doing this? Laughter, confused, sharp, uncomfortable, rippling through the crowd. Says the girl who literally bought a new face? Time stopped. There was a beat of stunned silence so complete you could hear the chandeliers humming. Some guests gasped. Others chuckled nervously, assuming it was part of some inside joke they didn't understand. I stood there, frozen, the mic still in my hand, my speech still unfinished. Jessica smirked. She tilted her head like she was playing coy, like this was all just hilarious, like she hadn't just tried to gut me in front of 100 people. Kidding, Liv. God. It's just a joke. Lighten up. But the damage was already done. The air changed. The laughter faded into whispers. My father looked horrified. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Colin turned to Jessica, clearly unsure whether to smile or step in. I stared at my sister, my beautiful, brittle sister, who had just shattered the only moment I had ever claimed for myself. And suddenly, I didn't feel invisible. I felt done. But I wasn't going to cry. The microphone was still in my hand when the laughter died, dry, brittle, forced laughter that belonged to no one in particular, as though the room had momentarily short-circuited and didn't know whether to applaud, chuckle, or cringe in silence. Jessica's voice, sweet and venom-laced, still echoed in my head, says the girl who literally bought a new face? A sentence meant to dismember, a dagger wrapped in a champagne toast. But I didn't cry. Not even a flicker. Instead, I gently placed the folded speech on the podium, unread, unfinished, unwanted, and took a small step back from the microphone. My hands were steady. My breath was slow. But inside, something ancient and knotted and bruised was stretching itself upright for the very first time. The girl who had spent 2 decades building altars of silence to keep her family comfortable was no longer interested in shrinking to fit their favorite picture frame. I turned away from the mic. And then I turned back. Not to plead, not to excuse, not to explain, but to finish what I had started. The microphone, mercifully still hot, caught my words as they sliced through the velvet-angled quiet of the ballroom. You know, I began, my voice measured, unwavering. It wasn't the surgery that changed me. A low murmur swept through the crowd, guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting from Jessica to me and back again, uncertain whether to look away or lean in closer. I watched Jessica's face stiffen, her smile faltering just a fraction. It was learning how easily people like you, I continued, eyes locked on hers, can smile while cutting someone open. The room fell into a silence so complete, so dense with tension, I could hear someone in the back accidentally drop their dessert fork. No one laughed now. Even the string quartet in the corner had stopped mid-prelude, as if they, too, could sense something tectonic unfolding. I looked out at the crowd, cousins, co-workers, friends of friends, extended family who barely remembered my name but always remembered to ask about Jessica's latest creative project. And I spoke. When I was 14, Jessica called me Pinocchio for a year straight because of my nose. Every day at breakfast. At school. At the dinner table. She even wrote it on the inside of my locker with a Sharpie, big black letters so everyone could see it. And when I cried? When I begged for it to stop? I paused, scanning the crowd, then found my mother's face, frozen, pale, expressionless. My mother told me not to make a scene. Gasps. Audible now. Some from sympathy. Some from the sharp realization that they'd all been part of the applause track that had played under Jessica's life for so long. I stopped smiling in photos that year. I stopped raising my hand in class. I wore my hair forward, hid behind it like a curtain. When my 8th grade crush, Ryan Morales, asked me if my dad was a woodworker, because how else could I have a nose like that? I laughed along, pretended it was clever. I cried in a bathroom stall during lunch and told myself that someday, if I just stayed quiet and kind and helpful enough, maybe people would forget I existed long enough to stop hurting me. I heard a chair scrape across the marble floor, someone shifting in embarrassment. Jessica opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised a hand and kept going. But the funny thing is, I said, my voice growing quieter, slower, heavier with each syllable, no one ever did. They never forgot. They remembered I was there to take the blame, to clean the mess, to cover the bills, to stay behind while someone else shined. I turned to Jessica fully now, not blinking, not flinching. Do you remember when you failed out of Arizona State? When you told Mom and Dad it wasn't your fault, that the environment was toxic and your professors didn't get you? Do you remember how you said you wanted a second chance, that you were going to reinvent yourself at that marketing program downtown? She blinked rapidly, her eyes glassy now, her jaw clenched so tightly I could almost hear her molars grinding. You never told anyone who paid for that second chance, did you? Whispers now, swirling like smoke. I did. I covered part of your tuition. I canceled a trip I'd planned for 2 years. I stayed behind in an apartment with a leaking bathroom and mold in the corners while you posted selfies from music festivals and wrote captions about second chances and self-growth. And not once, did you say thank you. I scanned the room again, locking eyes with anyone brave enough to meet mine. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because I want to be done. Because for 31 years, I have been expected to show up with love no matter what. No matter how I was treated. No matter how invisible I felt. No matter how many jokes were made at my expense, or how many times I was told to be quiet so someone else could shine brighter. My voice cracked for the first time, not from weakness, but from the strain of truth that had never been given voice until now. I loved my sister more than anyone should ever love someone who makes a sport out of forgetting you exist. And for years, I thought that was noble. That it was a sign of character. That if I just gave enough, they'd eventually notice I was standing there. I looked at my mother now, rigid, mortified, her wine glass trembling slightly in her hand. But they never did. Silence. Not stunned. Not offended. Just still. I stepped away from the microphone. Every eye in the ballroom followed me as I walked down the center aisle between gold-plated chairs and half-eaten entrees. Jessica stood frozen on the dais, her veil trembling, her mouth still slightly open in disbelief. Colin had one hand on her arm, but his face had turned toward me, slack-jawed and dazed. Even the photographer had lowered her camera. I didn't look back. Not once. I walked past the catering staff, past the coordinator whispering furiously into her headset, past my cousins with their manicured sympathy and carefully curated neutral expressions. I walked out the heavy double doors and into the hallway, where the sound of clinking glasses and awkward murmurs was muffled by thick, expensive walls. Then I walked through the front doors of the estate. The air outside was humid, pressing down on my lungs like a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. I could still hear echoes of my speech in my head, sharp and crystalline, like the final chords of a symphony that no one expected to end. My heels clicked against the stone walkway as I headed toward my car. I was trembling now, not with regret, but with something that felt dangerously close to liberation. The girl I had been would have begged for forgiveness already. She would have circled back, offered an apology for ruining the mood, smoothed over the edges so Jessica could be the bride again without interruption. But that girl was gone. I opened the car door and sat behind the wheel, my hands still shaking. I didn't turn the engine on right away. I sat there, breathing in the heavy summer air, letting the silence of the outside world wrap around me like a bomb. I thought of the years I had spent swallowing myself whole so other people wouldn't have to be uncomfortable. I thought of the dreams I had deferred, the apologies I had made for existing, the endless reservoir of patience I had drawn from until it ran dry. I thought of Jessica's face, smirking, then stunned. And I thought, finally, she had seen me. It's been 71 days since I walked out of that ballroom in a champagne silk dress that never quite fit, leaving behind the echoes of my own voice, the stunned faces of distant cousins, and the fallout of a family narrative I no longer believed in. I know the exact number of days because every morning since then, I've woken up and crossed another tally mark on a small notepad that now lives on my bedside table. It isn't punishment, and it isn't regret, it's just a record of time spent becoming someone new. The aftermath was quieter than I expected, but no less complicated. Within hours, word of what happened at Jessica's wedding had splintered through our extended family like a lightning strike, each retelling laced with interpretation, bias, and revision. Some relatives texted me vague affirmations, messages like "that was brave" or "you said what needed to be said," always sent in private, never accompanied by anything as concrete as support. Others chose silence, and a few, mainly my mother's siblings and their equally image-obsessed children, let it be known that they found my actions inappropriate, emotional, and unbecoming for a woman of my intelligence. One cousin suggested, gently and with great performative concern, that I might want to apologize for the setting, even if the feelings were valid. I didn't respond to that message. 3 weeks after the wedding, Jessica sent me a text that arrived on a Sunday morning, nestled between a work email and a spam offer for a discounted vacation package to Aruba. It read, "I'm sorry you felt like you had to say all that. I didn't mean to hurt you. Hope we can move forward." That was it. No acknowledgement of what she said. No mention of the years I spent cleaning up her messes or funding her dreams. Just a neatly wrapped bundle of avoidance disguised as peacemaking. I stared at the text for 20 minutes, wondering if my silence would be misread as forgiveness or defiance. Eventually, I deleted it without replying. Not out of spite, but because some conversations, once ignored for too long, rot from the inside out and become unsalvageable. After the wedding, I moved into a new apartment, a bright third-floor walk-up in Lincoln Park, with creaky hardwood floors, exposed brick, and a tiny balcony that catches the morning light like a secret. It's not particularly large, and the plumbing hums when the shower runs, but it feels like mine in a way no space ever has before. I chose every dish, every pillow, every candle scent. I lined the bookshelves with the stories I'd always meant to read. I hung photos of cities I've never been to but now plan to visit. It took me 4 separate attempts to fill out the intake form for therapy. Every time I sat down to answer the question, "What brings you here?" I found myself hovering over the keyboard, unsure how to condense 31 years of being overlooked, undermined, and expected to swallow my own pain without complaint into a single paragraph. Eventually, I typed, "I'm tired of being the one who holds it all together while no one holds me." That was enough. My therapist, Camille, is in her 40s, with a calm voice and expressive eyes that catch every micro-expression you think you've concealed. She doesn't rush. She doesn't interrupt. She asks questions that echo in my head long after the session ends. The first time she asked me why I stayed silent for so long, I started listing reasons like a defense attorney, family harmony, Jessica's mental health, my mother's expectations, cultural pressure, fear of being called dramatic. Camille listened patiently before asking, "And what did you lose by staying silent?" That question broke something open in me. Because the truth was, I had lost years. I had lost birthdays spent at other people's parties, vacations that never happened, nights when I needed comfort and instead provided it. I had lost sleep, money, dignity. I had lost the simple human need to be seen and loved without conditions. But I also learned something: silence is not noble when it protects harm. Quiet isn't always the high road, it's often just the detour we take because we're afraid of what honesty will cost. I started writing again, nothing polished or profound, just pieces of memory scribbled into a leather journal I kept by my bedside. I wrote about being 15 and hiding in the school library during lunch because I was too embarrassed to eat in front of anyone. I wrote about the day I wore braces and glasses and still tried to talk to Ryan Morales, only to have him laugh and walk away. I wrote about standing in the corner at Jessica's high school graduation while my parents clutched her award and forgot I existed. The act of writing wasn't for an audience. It was for reclamation. It was for every version of me that had ever been erased. Eventually, I started posting anonymously on a forum for women navigating toxic family dynamics. I didn't use names, didn't share photos, just stories. I expected nothing, no fanfare, no likes, no comments. But the replies came anyway. Strangers from across the world wrote to say, "That was me too," or "Thank you for putting this into words," or "I didn't know how much I needed this until now." I didn't reply to most of them. I didn't have to. Sometimes healing doesn't come from connection, it comes from release. This new version of my life isn't cinematic. There are no dramatic reunions or perfect redemptions. My mother still hasn't called. Jessica's social media is back to wedding recaps and influencer collaborations. My father, quietly caught in the crossfire as always, sends me occasional emails about book recommendations or TED Talks he thinks I'd like. I read them. Sometimes I reply. Sometimes I don't. I've started traveling alone, small trips at first. A long weekend in Sedona. A train ride to Minneapolis just to see a museum exhibit I'd been meaning to visit for years. I bring a journal, my favorite playlist, and no one else's expectations. I take photos, not for likes, not for stories, just to remind myself that I was there. That I lived. This morning, I found an old shoebox while unpacking the last of my things, a box I had forgotten about, shoved into the back of a closet in my previous apartment. Inside were old letters, ticket stubs, a worn-out charm bracelet from high school, and a photo of me at 17. In the photo, I'm sitting on the edge of my twin bed, legs tucked beneath me, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big and a cautious smile that doesn't quite reach my eyes. I stare at that photo for a long time. I remember exactly how that girl felt, tethered to hope she couldn't name, convinced she had to earn her place by shrinking, folding, deferring. I take the photo and place it beside the mirror in my bedroom, right where the sunlight hits it in the morning. Then I whisper to her, not out loud, not dramatically, just barely above breath. You were always enough. And for the first time in my life, I believe it.